Well, I feel I've succeeded what I wanted to do as a single artist. Well, we are doing it in a lot of places. We're on a tour now. We'll be out until...
He had the voice that could float above any harmony, a falsetto so pure it made grown men weep. As co-founder of The Temptations, Eddie Kendricks helped define the sound of Motown. But when the curtain fell, his name faded into the shadows. He walked away from the group at the height of their fame, chose to follow a solo path on his own terms, and later faced a disease that would quietly steal him far too soon. This is the story of a soul legend who gave everything to music, yet was buried under its spotlight. Eddie Kendricks shaped the soundtrack of an era, but his legacy was too often reduced to a single role, the falsetto voice. Behind the soaring notes was a man who dreamed, doubted, struggled, and persevered. Before the screaming fans, before the Motown suits and synchronized steps, there was simply a boy named Eddie. Born in Union Springs, Alabama, and raised in Birmingham during the Jim Crow era, his world was divided by segregation. Yet in the tight-knit black community, there was one sanctuary where heaven felt close: the church. It was there, under stained glass and wooden pews, that Eddie discovered his gift. His voice, light and smooth, startled listeners with its clarity. By his teenage years, the skinny boy with the high, angelic tone was turning heads and silencing rooms. People leaned forward not just to hear him sing, but to feel what he carried in every note: possibility. From those humble beginnings to Detroit's streets, from church choirs to global fame, Eddie Kendricks would become a voice both unforgettable and underappreciated. This is his story. Eddie James Kendricks entered the world on the 17th of December, 1939, in the small town of Union Springs, Alabama. His childhood unfolded in Birmingham, during the height of the Jim Crow era. For a young black boy in the Deep South, segregation wasn't an abstract debate or a law printed on paper. It was the air he breathed, shaping every corner of his daily life. Schools, buses, restaurants, neighborhoods, everything was divided. And yet, in those tightly bound communities, Eddie discovered something powerful: resilience, tradition, and faith. The church became his first stage and his first sanctuary. In a world where the rules outside its walls tried to tell him who he could be, the church told him he could be anything. Beneath stained glass windows, standing before wooden pews filled with neighbors, he found his voice. It wasn't a booming shout or a rough gospel growl. It was something entirely different: light, clear, impossibly smooth, a voice that seemed to float above the choir instead of competing with it. Even as a boy, Eddie's falsetto stopped people in their tracks. Adults turned their heads, astonished by the sound that poured out of such a slim, quiet teenager. His singing didn't just entertain, it lifted spirits, reminding listeners that beauty could exist even in a divided world. Eddie's musical journey soon intertwined with another young talent on the Birmingham streets, Paul Williams. Where others heard competition, Eddie and Paul heard harmony. Their connection was instant, their ambitions aligned. Together, they began experimenting with sound, blending their voices until they moved as one. Friendship quickly turned into partnership, and before long, they formed a group called the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers weren't stars, but they were a start. Performing at church functions, school events, and talent shows, they sharpened their skills, learning how to command attention, how to hold a room, how to dream bigger than their surroundings. But Alabama, no matter how rich in church choirs and neighborhood talent, couldn't contain their aspirations. For Eddie and Paul, applause was never the final goal. They wanted escape, opportunity, and the chance to live by their voices rather than factory whistles. In 1957, they made a decision that would change everything. They packed their hopes and a few belongings, and they headed north to Detroit. Detroit was a city in transition. The auto industry dominated, but its cultural heartbeat was music. The streets buzzed with doo-wop groups, their harmonies echoing through stairwells and storefronts. It was a place where you could feel possibility in the air, where any corner harmony could become tomorrow's headline. For Eddie and Paul, it was a leap of faith, but one they were willing to risk. In Detroit, they reformed their group under a new name, the Primes. With the guidance of manager Milton Jenkins, the Primes became more than just another vocal outfit. Jenkins understood that in the Motown era, style mattered as much as sound. He drilled them in stage presence, choreography, and presentation. Every move, every note had to look effortless. They soon built a reputation in local clubs, dazzling audiences with tight harmonies and polished performances. Jenkins, seeing the potential, didn't stop there. He created a female counterpart to the group, the Primates. That ensemble, as fate would have it, later evolved into one of Motown's most iconic acts, the Supremes. The connection between the Primes and Primates reflected the kind of ecosystem Detroit fostered, young talent orbiting each other, sharpening skills, and building futures together. Within the Primes, Eddie began to shine not just as a singer, but as an arranger. He had an instinctive ear for structure, able to sense which voice belonged on which line, how harmonies should stack, and when his falsetto should glide above the rest. This ability separated him from countless other singers who might hit the notes but didn't know how to build the architecture of sound. Eddie thought like a craftsman, shaping voices into something larger than themselves. But Detroit wasn't easy. Competition was fierce, and opportunities were scarce. Many groups burned out, settling for steady paychecks on assembly lines rather than chasing elusive fame. Eddie and Paul refused to settle. They sang in clubs, at showcases, wherever an audience might listen. They practiced relentlessly, refusing to fade into the background. They were determined not to be another name lost to the noise of Motor City. By the early 1960 seconds, fate aligned their paths with other hungry young singers. Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin, members of a group called The Distance, crossed paths with Eddie and Paul. The connection was natural. Ambition met ambition, and the blend of voices hinted at something greater. Soon, they would merge their talents. The final missing piece would come with David Ruffin, a voice of raw gospel fire. Together, these men formed a lineup that was destined for greatness. At first, they called themselves the Elgins. But Berry Gordy, the mastermind behind the rising Motown records, had other plans. Under his direction, the group would be reborn as the Temptations. In that moment, Eddie Kendricks, the skinny boy from Birmingham with the angelic falsetto, stepped into music history. Still, at this stage, Eddie was just Eddie, a church boy, a sharp dresser, a quiet thinker with a gift that could silence a room. What he wanted was simple: to sing, to be heard, and maybe, just maybe, to be remembered. He couldn't yet know how far his voice would carry, or how heavy the cost would be. Detroit in the early 1960 seconds was alive with ambition. Street corners became rehearsal halls, stairwells became echo chambers, and every young man with a voice dreamed of breaking through. For Eddie Kendricks, Paul Williams, Otis Williams, and Melvin Franklin, those dreams began to converge. Their separate paths merged into one when they decided to form a new group, pooling their talents and determination. Soon, with the addition of David Ruffin, whose fiery gospel voice could command any room, the lineup felt complete. They initially called themselves the Elgins, but destiny demanded more. When Berry Gordy, the mastermind behind Motown Records, took notice, he saw potential in their chemistry but insisted on a stronger identity. Under his guidance, they became the Temptations, a name that would soon echo across radio waves and concert halls worldwide. Yet at the time, success was anything but guaranteed. Signing with Motown in 1961 was both an opportunity and a trial. Gordy's vision was precise. Every act had to be polished, disciplined, and ready to cross over to mainstream America. Talent alone wasn't enough. The Temptations found themselves in a grind of endless rehearsals, fine-tuning every note, every step, every gesture. Legendary choreographer Charlie Atkins drilled them until their movements were seamless, their stage presence magnetic. It was artistry shaped into science. But perfection didn't equal popularity. For nearly 2 years, the Temptations struggled to find a hit. They recorded song after song, but nothing cracked the charts. Around Motown's Hitsville, USA, they earned an unkind nickname, the Hitless Temptations. The joke stung, a constant reminder that brilliance without recognition could feel like failure. Yet instead of folding, they doubled down. Their hunger sharpened, their harmonies grew tighter, their choreography sharper, their resolve stronger. In this period of trial, Eddie Kendricks emerged as a quiet but vital center. He wasn't loud or demanding, but his falsetto brought an elegance that separated the group from their peers. While Ruffin's grit and Paul's smooth baritone provided power and depth, Eddie's voice floated above like silk in the wind. His natural instinct for arranging harmonies made him not just a singer, but an architect of their sound. The Detroit streets reminded them constantly of what was at stake. Countless groups with talent ended up back in factories, swallowed by the grind of the Motor City. The Temptations knew they were one failed record away from the same fate. That urgency drove them harder. They couldn't afford to fade. Their perseverance laid the foundation for what was coming. Motown was a machine, but within it, the Temptations were becoming a finely tuned engine, ready to roar once they finally found the right song. Eddie Kendricks, the boy from Birmingham with the angelic falsetto, was about to step into a moment that would silence the jokes and redefine soul music. The turning point arrived in 1964. Smokey Robinson, Motown's golden boy and hitmaker, handed the Temptations a song that seemed almost tailored for them, The Way You Do the Things You Do. Light, clever, and playful, it needed a voice that could glide above the harmonies without overpowering them. Eddie Kendricks stepped into the spotlight. His falsetto gave the song its spark, turning a simple lyric into something magnetic. When it climbed to number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100, the cruel nickname of Hitless Temptations vanished overnight. With that breakthrough, the Temptations entered a golden run. Soon, the addition of David Ruffin's gritty gospel punch completed their chemistry. Together, Ruffin, Kendricks, and Paul Williams formed a vocal triangle few groups could rival. Ruffin's raw power, Paul's silky baritone, and Eddie's angelic falsetto. Each voice was distinct, yet together they created a blend that felt larger than life. Hit after hit poured out of Hitsville, USA. My Girl became an anthem of young love. Ain't Too Proud to Beg brought urgency to the dance floor. Get Ready showcased their versatility, and Beauty is Only Skin Deep reminded audiences of their emotional range. On television, their performances became cultural events. Matching suits, immaculate choreography drilled by Charlie Atkins, and 5 voices locked in harmony, they embodied Motown's promise of polish and perfection. Through it all, Eddie remained the quiet star. He didn't crave headlines, but his falsetto became the Temptations' secret weapon. His presence on stage, slim, stylish, reserved, was matched by the sheer power of his voice. He could make audiences scream without raising his volume, seduce without exaggeration, and leave listeners breathless with a single soaring note. Then came 1971 and Just My Imagination, Running Away With Me. Written by Norman Whitfield and Barrett Strong, it was a throwback to the softer ballads Eddie loved. At a time when Motown was chasing psychedelic funk, Eddie delivered the lead with devastating vulnerability. His falsetto carried longing and heartbreak in equal measure, wrapping listeners in a dream that felt both intimate and universal. The song reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, cementing Eddie's place not just as a harmony singer, but as a voice capable of defining an era. To the world, the Temptations had achieved perfection. They were Motown's crown jewel, the act that embodied elegance and soul. But behind the suits and synchronized smiles, pressures were mounting. David Ruffin's erratic behavior, Paul Williams' personal struggles, and growing tensions over the group's musical direction were already sowing seeds of conflict. For Eddie Kendricks, the triumph of Just My Imagination was also the beginning of difficult choices that would test his loyalty to the group he helped create. By the mid-1960 seconds, the Temptations had evolved from struggling hopefuls into Motown's flagship act. They were no longer just another vocal group trying to stand out. They had become the very definition of what Motown wanted the world to see: style, discipline, and soul blended into one seamless package. On stage, they appeared immaculate. 5 tall, sharp-dressed men whose choreography was so tight it looked like one body moving in unison. Off stage, their records dominated radios and jukeboxes, blasting from cars and corner bars across the country. Television amplified their rise. Appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show and other national programs turned them into household names. Millions of viewers watched as Eddie Kendricks stepped to the microphone, slim and poised, his falsetto floating effortlessly above the harmonies. He didn't need to belt or gesture wildly. His voice was its own spectacle. Smooth, controlled, and impossibly delicate, it carried an intimacy that made listeners feel he was singing directly to them. Each performance reminded the world that Eddie wasn't just part of the Temptations, he was their secret ingredient, the falsetto that gave their sound its haunting edge. The group's catalog grew into a run of hits that defined the decade. My Girl became more than a love song, it was a cultural anthem. Ain't Too Proud to Beg showcased their urgency and grit. Get Ready filled dance floors with its infectious groove, while Beauty Is Only Skin Deep displayed their versatility. Each track bore the fingerprints of their unique blend, with Eddie's falsetto weaving through the harmonies like light through smoke. In those years, Eddie cemented his reputation as the quiet star. While David Ruffin often grabbed headlines with his dramatic vocals and unpredictable behavior, Eddie let the music speak for him. His falsetto became a calling card, a sound fans instantly recognized. He was proof that power didn't have to shout, it could whisper and still shake the heart. Yet within the perfection was pressure. The machine of Motown was relentless, demanding constant output, constant reinvention. Every new hit had to be bigger than the last. Behind the curtain, cracks began to appear. Ruffin's ego-strained relationships, Paul Williams battled inner demons, and Eddie himself grew uneasy with the group's direction. Motown was inching toward new sounds, longer songs, funkier arrangements, political overtones under Norman Whitfield's production. For Eddie, who valued melody, romance, and harmony, the shift felt unsettling. Still, in the public eye, the Temptations seemed unstoppable. They toured endlessly, filling venues with screaming fans. Women fainted in the aisles, newspapers hailed them as the kings of soul, and Berry Gordy positioned them as Motown's crown jewel. They had transcended race and class, winning over mainstream America without sacrificing their identity. For Eddie, it was both exhilarating and exhausting. He loved the music, loved the connection with audiences, but the growing weight of fame and industry demands pressed against his quiet, introspective nature. By 1971, Eddie's falsetto reached its most iconic moment with Just My Imagination, Running Away With Me. The ballad soared to #1, a tender reminder of what had made the Temptations legendary in the first place: heartfelt melodies, seamless harmonies, and voices that carried pure emotion. Eddie's delivery was fragile yet unshakable, a confession wrapped in sound. For many fans, it was the definitive Temptations song, and it was Eddie's masterpiece. But the triumph carried a shadow. While the world celebrated, Eddie was already questioning his place in the group. The brotherhood was fraying, the sound was shifting, and the pressures were mounting. The boy from Alabama, who had dreamed of simply being heard now, stood at the peak of fame, wondering if the price of perfection was too high. The next step he would take would change not only his life, but the history of the Temptations forever. The triumph of Just My Imagination in 1971 might have seemed like the perfect celebration of everything Eddie Kendricks had worked toward. For fans, it was a dream fulfilled, the Temptations at their most romantic, led by Eddie's falsetto gliding like silk through the air. But behind the scenes, the song was less a culmination than a farewell. Even as it climbed to #1, Eddie was quietly preparing to walk away. Motown was evolving under producer Norman Whitfield. The Temptations, once the masters of tender ballads and polished choreography, were now being pushed into psychedelic soul. The records grew longer, layered with political messages, distorted guitar riffs, and funk grooves that mirrored the turbulence of late -1960 seconds America. For Eddie, the shift was jarring. He had built his identity on romance, harmony, and clarity. He believed in music as emotional storytelling. Psychedelic experimentation felt like noise drowning out the beauty he loved. The musical tensions fed personal ones. Eddie's relationship with Otis Williams, once a foundation of the group, had soured. Eddie saw Otis as increasingly controlling, more interested in preserving power than preserving artistry. Otis, in turn, viewed Eddie as distant and defiant, unwilling to compromise for the sake of unity. Rehearsals turned cold. Conversations dissolved into arguments. The choreography remained tight, but the bond behind it was unraveling. Then there was Paul Williams, Eddie's closest friend since their teenage years in Birmingham. Paul had been more than a bandmate, he was a brother. But Paul was spiraling. Alcoholism and depression consumed him, eroding the sharp performer he once was. On stage, he forgot lyrics, missed cues, or vanished altogether. Motown's response was ruthless. A stand-in was placed on stage to mimic Paul's movements, so the group's image of perfection could continue. For Eddie, watching his lifelong friend deteriorate while the machine marched on was unbearable. All of this compounded Eddie's disillusionment. He had always been loyal to Paul, to the group, to the dream they built together. But now he felt like a stranger in his own house. Motown no longer sounded like the sanctuary it once was. The Temptations no longer felt like the brotherhood they had promised to be. He wanted out not just from the music, but from the politics, the egos, the compromises that seemed to strip away the purity he cherished. By early 1971, his decision was made. Eddie Kendricks officially left the Temptations. For fans, the news landed like a shockwave. How could the voice that carried just my imagination walk away at the very moment of triumph? For Eddie, though, the choice wasn't about fame, it was about survival. He wanted creative control, peace of mind, and freedom to shape music on his own terms. Motown did little to honor his departure. There was no grand farewell, no tribute to his years of contribution. It was as if the machine had already moved on, as though one of its founding voices could simply be erased from the story. Eddie carried the hurt, but he also carried determination. His falsetto was still intact. His vision was still clear. And now, unshackled from the group's battles, he was ready to prove that his artistry could shine on its own. The Temptations marched forward with Dennis Edwards at the helm, embracing Whitfield's psychedelic vision. Eddie, meanwhile, stepped into the uncertain world of a solo career. For him, the peak of Just My Imagination was both an ending and a beginning. He had sung one of the most unforgettable ballads of the Motown era, and in doing so, had also sung himself out of the Temptations. When Eddie Kendricks walked away from the Temptations in 1971, many thought it was career suicide. How could anyone step out of the brightest spotlight in soul music and hope to survive? For Eddie, though, the decision wasn't about survival in the commercial sense. It was about preserving the integrity of his music. He was tired of compromises, of watching harmony drown under layers of distortion. Leaving wasn't ego, it was self-preservation. Signing with Motown as a solo artist, Eddie set out to prove that his falsetto could still command the charts. In 1972, he released his first solo album, All by Myself. It wasn't a runaway success, but it was a statement. Eddie wasn't just the falsetto of the Temptations. He was his own artist, with his own sound. The album leaned into tenderness, slower grooves, and subtle arrangements, proof that he was determined to hold on to melody in an industry rushing toward trends. The breakthrough came a year later. In 1973, Eddie released Keep On Truckin'. Funky, defiant, and undeniably catchy, the track soared to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was Eddie's declaration of independence, a reminder to fans and skeptics alike that he wasn't just a supporting voice, he was a star in his own right. The success shocked critics, silenced doubters, and gave Eddie a second life in the industry. The momentum continued with Boogie Down in 1974, which climbed into the top 10, and Shoeshine Boy, another hit that kept his name alive on the charts. For a stretch, Eddie Kendricks was not just surviving post-Temptations, he was thriving. His falsetto remained light, but it had aged into something richer. It carried experience now, a subtle rasp that made the vulnerability even more believable. As a solo artist, Eddie explored more than just romance. Free from the group, he experimented with funkier grooves, jazz-inflected soul, and introspective ballads. His records weren't always blockbuster sellers, but they were authentic. Each one reflected a man determined not to chase fads, but to stay true to his craft. In an industry built on reinvention and spectacle, Eddie's quiet insistence on authenticity set him apart even if it cost him headlines. Yet success was never the whole story. Eddie wasn't built for celebrity culture. Away from the stage, he was soft-spoken, reserved, almost aloof. He didn't crave interviews, didn't light up red carpets, didn't play the media game that others mastered. Fame had already exacted a price during his Temptations years, and now he preferred solitude. To some, that made him enigmatic. To others, it made him invisible. The absence of his Temptations brothers also weighed on him. The camaraderie that once cushioned the grind of the music industry was gone. He missed Paul Williams most of all. Their friendship, born on Birmingham streets, had carried them to Detroit and beyond. Without that constant presence, Eddie felt the sting of loneliness more deeply. David Ruffin, volatile as he was, had also been a creative kindred spirit. Though they reconnected occasionally, the distance between them grew with time. During this period, Eddie also turned inward spiritually. Tired of the superficialities of the entertainment world, he began exploring Islam. He wasn't public about it, never staged a conversion for headlines, but friends noticed the shift. He became more reflective, more centered, more detached from the chaos around him. For a man who had always been quiet, the exploration of faith provided a deeper sense of grounding. By the late 1972, the industry itself was changing. Disco was surging, funk was hardening, and Motown's dominance was fading. Eddie tried to adapt, but he refused to chase fads. His music stayed true to his voice, his instincts. That choice, while honorable, carried a cost. Radio stations played him less. Album sales slowed. Younger audiences, unaware of his history, drifted toward new names. Even Motown, the empire he had helped build, seemed to forget one of its own architects. Still, Eddie never begged for relevance. He didn't seek comebacks through nostalgia tours or public feuds. Instead, he kept performing, often in smaller venues, still giving everything to the stage. His audiences may have been smaller, but they were loyal. To them, he was still the voice of just my imagination, still the man who could turn longing into melody. Night after night, he proved that even when the industry turned its back, his falsetto could still bring people to silence. But beneath the smooth delivery, Eddie carried invisible weight, regret, nostalgia, and the creeping sense that he had given everything and still hadn't been fully seen. The man who once stood at the center of Motown's crown jewel was now on its margins, still singing, still giving, but wondering if the world would ever truly recognize what he had given. For Eddie Kendricks, the 1,980 seconds brought more than shifting trends in music. They brought personal storms that no chart position could shield him from. The first and deepest wound came in 1973 with the loss of his dearest friend, Paul Williams. Eddie and Paul had walked side by side since Birmingham, harmonizing on porches, forming the Cavaliers, daring to move north to Detroit. They had been brothers in ambition, bound by a dream. But by the early 1,970 seconds, Paul was drowning in alcoholism and depression, made worse by the cruel reality of sickle cell anemia. When Paul ended his own life in a Detroit alleyway, Eddie was shattered. He carried guilt that he couldn't pull his friend back from the edge. To him, Paul's death was not just a personal tragedy, it was the breaking of the foundation that had carried him from childhood into stardom. That grief lingered like a shadow through the years. Even as Eddie scored hits and toured, Paul's absence haunted him. Each harmony line reminded him of what had been lost. And Motown's cold efficiency substituting a stand-in for Paul during his decline only deepened Eddie's disillusionment. To him, the industry no longer looked like music. It looked like a machine. Then came another blow. David Ruffin, the fiery tenor whose chemistry with Eddie had helped define the Temptations' greatest years, spiraled for decades in and out of addiction. Despite their ups and downs, Eddie and David remained connected. They reunited in the late 1,980 seconds, performing with Dennis Edwards in a trio that reignited interest in their legacy. On stage together, the old fire flickered again, a reminder of what once made Motown unstoppable. But in 1991, David died of a drug overdose in Philadelphia. For Eddie, it was another piece of his past ripped away. First Paul, now David, the brothers who had shared his greatest triumphs, were gone. Amid the grief, Eddie faced his own battle. In the mid-negative 1,980 seconds, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, the result of years of heavy smoking. For a man whose falsetto had once floated effortlessly above harmonies, the disease was devastating. Breathing became harder. Singing became a struggle. Yet Eddie refused to surrender. He kept touring, kept performing, even as his body betrayed him. Each show became a test of endurance, every note a small act of defiance against the illness that threatened to silence him. Still, he found moments of reconciliation. His long, frozen relationship with Otis Williams began to thaw. After years of distance, the two men talked, not with grand apologies but with honesty. Otis later described those conversations as real and meaningful. Eddie, who had once seen Otis as controlling, came to accept him again as a brother. It was a small but profound peace. The most poignant moment of Eddie's final years came in June 1991 at David Ruffin's funeral. Frail, gaunt, almost skeletal, Eddie insisted on attending. He walked into New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit, the same church once pastored by Aretha Franklin's father, leaning on friends for support. When the music started, Eddie rose slowly to the microphone. The band began My Girl, that immortal anthem of joy he had helped create decades earlier. His voice was thinner now, weakened by illness, but still true. Each note carried the weight of grief for Paul, for David, for the years gone by. The congregation fell silent, transfixed by a man giving everything he had left. That performance, raw and trembling, would be his last. Afterward, Eddie returned to Birmingham, back to the city where his voice had first been nurtured in church pews. Surrounded by family and close friends, he spent his final months away from the industry that had both elevated and abandoned him. He no longer spoke much about fame. Instead, he talked about peace, about God, about letting go. On the 5th of October 1992, Eddie Kendricks passed away at the age of 52. There were no national headlines, no glossy tributes. His death came quietly, almost too quietly for a man who had given so much. But for those who listened, for those who remembered the falsetto that floated above the Temptations, Eddie's voice never truly left. Even in silence, it lingered. His life had been a mixture of triumph and tragedy, of soaring notes and devastating losses. And in the end, the conflict that defined him was not between fame and obscurity, but between a world that wanted spectacle and a man who insisted on truth. Eddie Kendricks may have died in 1992, far from the spotlight, but his voice never disappeared. In fact, in the years that followed, it began to echo in unexpected places. The falsetto that once seemed fragile, even overlooked, revealed itself as the foundation for a new generation of soul artists. While awards and headlines often bypassed his name, musicians knew exactly what he had given them: a blueprint for intimacy in song. One of the clearest heirs to that blueprint was Maxwell. When his debut album Urban Hang Suite arrived in the mid-1,990 seconds, critics hailed it as the rebirth of sensual soul. But beneath the contemporary production, listeners could hear Eddie's influence. Maxwell's buttery delivery, his ability to make a whisper feel louder than a shout, came directly from the path Eddie had carved. Every falsetto note carried a trace of Kendrick's featherlight control. D'Angelo, another pillar of neo-soul, also drew from Eddie's legacy. Known for layering harmonies that sounded both ancient and new, D'Angelo married gospel grit with soft falsetto murmurs. The intimacy of his sound, the way it felt like he was singing directly into your ear, was pure Kendrick's lineage. Eddie had shown that tenderness could be power, and D'Angelo carried that lesson into a new century. Usher, too, bore the mark. Rising in the late 1,990 seconds and early 2,000 seconds, Usher became one of the defining voices of R&B. His control in the upper register, the way he could shift from chest voice into a falsetto without breaking the emotional flow, echoed Eddie's style. Songs like Nice and Slow or Can You Handle It revealed the direct influence of Kendrick's philosophy, that vulnerability, not volume, is what moves an audience. Even Prince, who had long redefined the possibilities of falsetto, spoke reverently of Eddie Kendricks. Prince described him as one of the only singers who could make a listener feel like they were levitating. That was the true magic of Eddie's voice. It lifted without effort, made pain sound beautiful, and turned longing into something universal. What all these artists shared was an understanding that Eddie's falsetto wasn't just a technique, it was an emotional language. He could plead, seduce, heal, and break your heart without raising his volume. In a world where soul singers often equated power with force, Eddie redefined power as reach. Range might impress, but reach touching the listener in the deepest part of themselves was eternal. By the time the 1,990 seconds gave way to the 2,000 seconds, critics began to recognize Eddie Kendricks as more than just a temptation. He was a stylist, a pioneer of falsetto soul, the connective tissue between gospel choirs and the neo-soul renaissance. Younger artists may not have always known his name, but they carried his sound. His legacy lived not in plaques or awards, but in every voice that tried to capture intimacy without shouting. Eddie Kendricks' influence didn't end with singers. Hip-hop, the sound of a new generation, found treasure in his recordings. Producers digging through dusty crates of vinyl discovered his solo work, particularly deep cuts that the mainstream had overlooked. Suddenly, Eddie's falsetto was being reborn, looped, sampled, and stitched into beats that carried his voice into clubs, radios, and headphones decades after his passing. One track stood above the rest: Intimate Friends. Originally a gentle, mid-tempo groove from his solo career, it became one of the most sampled songs in hip-hop and R&B. Alicia Keys built Unbreakable on its foundation, using Eddie's warmth to anchor her own celebration of love. Common borrowed its richness for his storytelling, weaving Eddie's falsetto into the fabric of modern rap. The Wu-Tang Clan, known for unearthing obscure soul gems, sampled Eddie's melodies, giving their gritty verses a surprising tenderness. Even Tupac and Erykah Badu found inspiration in his catalog, proof that his voice could transcend genre, time, and culture. Through sampling, Eddie became immortal. His falsetto, once at risk of being forgotten, was now echoing in new forms, connecting generations who might never have known his name but instantly recognized the feeling his voice evoked. For hip-hop artists, Eddie represented authenticity, a raw soul presence that could give their tracks emotional depth. For R&B singers, he was proof that softness could carry strength. And yet, despite this resurgence, Eddie Kendricks remained a ghost in the machine. His name was often absent from credits, his story overshadowed by Motown's larger mythology. David Ruffin became the tragic star. Otis Williams became the chronicler. The Temptations as a unit were celebrated endlessly. Eddie, too often, was reduced to the falsetto one. His individuality folded into the group narrative. Recognition came slowly, and mostly after his death. In 1999, the Temptations were inducted into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame, a belated acknowledgement of the role Eddie had played in shaping their sound. Streets in Birmingham were renamed in his honor, ensuring that the city where his voice was born would never forget him. In Detroit, fans organized Eddie Kendricks Appreciation Nights, spinning his records in local clubs, singing his lyrics like scripture. These weren't grand ceremonies, but they were heartfelt tributes, proof that the people who knew always remembered. Perhaps the most enduring tribute to Eddie's legacy lies not in plaques or monuments, but in the pursuit of the feeling he gave the world. Every singer who steps to a microphone and chooses vulnerability over volume is echoing Eddie. Every producer who digs through old records searching for soul is listening for him. Every fan who hears Just My Imagination on a late-night playlist is carrying him forward. Eddie Kendricks was not forgotten. He was absorbed, woven into the DNA of modern music. His falsetto still floats not only above harmonies, but across decades, whispering to each new listener that tenderness can be eternal. Eddie Kendricks began with a falsetto that could silence a room, and he ended with a legacy that continues to echo long after his passing. His was a voice that needed no force to command attention. It floated, glided, and lingered, leaving listeners suspended in its softness. From the dusty pews of an Alabama church to the flashing stages of Detroit, Eddie carried the same truth, that vulnerability is its own kind of power. Yet for all he gave, the world often failed to give him back the recognition he deserved. He co-founded one of the greatest vocal groups in history, led them on hits that defined a generation, and carved a solo career that proved his artistry beyond the Temptations. And still, when Motown histories were written, Eddie's name was too often footnoted. While others were celebrated as tragic heroes or chroniclers of the era, Eddie became the quiet ghost the falsetto remembered, but the man too often forgotten. Why was he overlooked? Perhaps because he walked away from the machine at its height. Perhaps because he refused to play the media's game, choosing dignity over spectacle. Or perhaps because his genius was subtle. The industry rewards loudness, drama, and myth-making. Eddie gave none of those. He gave honesty instead, and honesty rarely makes headlines. But for those who listen closely, Eddie Kendricks was more than the falsetto one. He was the architect of harmonies, the stylist who taught generations that softness can be stronger than force. He was the friend who stood by Paul Williams until the end, the brother who reconciled with Otis Williams in middle age, the survivor who sang through cancer until he could no longer stand. He was a man who lived and died on his own terms. Today, his influence is everywhere, even if his name isn't always spoken. In Maxwell's whispers, in D'Angelo's layered harmonies, in Usher's soaring notes, in Prince's reverence, in hip-hop's endless samples, Eddie lives on. Every time Just My Imagination plays, every time a producer digs up intimate friends for a new generation, his voice is reborn. So the question remains, should Eddie Kendricks be remembered alongside the greats Marvin Gaye, Sam Cooke, Otis Redding? The answer, for those who know, is yes. Because greatness isn't only measured in awards or headlines, it's measured in the hearts moved, the artists inspired, the echoes that refuse to fade. Eddie Kendricks may have died quietly, but his voice never did. In every note that trembles with tenderness, in every falsetto that makes a room pause, Eddie is there. His name may not have always been shouted, but it has always been sung. And as long as people still listen, that high, haunting sound will keep floating above harmonies, above time, into eternity.